Thank you. Let me start with a couple of thank yous. One is I'd like to thank the Education in Zion exhibit. This is their auditorium, and they have a permanent multimedia exhibition on the second floor gallery of this building. We invite you to visit that newly opened exhibition at your convenience to explore the rich history and heritage of education at BYU and in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Let me also thank Randall Paul. Where is Randy? He's parking the car. Well, I'm going to thank him in his absence. He is the founder of the Foundation for International Interreligious Diplomacy, and it is through him that I have met Professor Pecherskaya, and I'm grateful for that. Professor Natalia Pecherskaya is the founder of the St. Petersburg School of Religion and Philosophy. She's a native from Leningrad, Russia. She currently acts as a chair of the Multidisciplinary Collaboration in Science, Religion, and Culture, preparing community leaders for the 21st Century Project. Prior to that, she worked as a researcher for the U.S. Department of State's Fulbright program, as well as a principal investigator for the religious basis of the contemporary problems in science and humanities. She's published more than 50 articles in leading domestic and foreign scholarly and public journals devoted to mathematics, and is the editor of 10 volumes of collected scholarly works in Russian and 8 volumes in English. She's the convener of the series Science and Faith in both Russian and English. She received a master's degree and a PhD in mathematics from Leningrad State University, and she speaks Russian, English, French, and German. And so I give you Professor Natalia Pecherskaya.
Thank you. So hello everyone. I'm glad that we have already our prayer. I also wanted to start with a prayer in Russian, but I think we already did it. We already understand each other. So what I'm going to do today, I will be speaking about the Russian Orthodoxy today, trying to show you the important problems we are witnessing in our country, but which probably are very common to everyone in the world who are doing studies, and also who are the believers, the church members. So what is going on in Russia? And certainly you know, I hope you know, about the 70 years of awful persecution of the church. And so you will see what are the new developments in the church after these awful years of dreadful persecution of the church members, of the priests. And to make it more easier to understand you, because I'm sure my Russian accent is rather strong, I decided that you will have also the text on the screen so that you will better understand me to put your questions after the lecture. So I will speak, and probably that will be about 30 minutes, and then we will go through the questions. So may I start? So after years and years of persecution, as I said, we can say that the continuing and all-embracing revival of church life of the Russian Orthodox Church is going on. And the general tendency to the development of all aspects of her diocese, parish, and social activities is becoming more and more vivid. There are already 128 dioceses now, instead of 67 ones in 1989. I'm mentioning 1989 as a crucial point because then perestroika started, the changes started. Gorbachev, as you know, started perestroika in the country. So this is a crucial year. And there are already 19 parishes in the canonical territory of the Russian Orthodox Church. According to modern statistics, Russian society is becoming more and more religious. For example, 57% of St. Petersburg population, the city where I'm from, call themselves Russian Orthodox. In Russian Federation, even more are thinking of themselves as the Russian Orthodox members, 61%. Unfortunately, their religiosity is sometimes neither dogmatically nor ethically oriented, and the people who say that they are Russian Orthodox can very often practice occultism. If we take the key question of abortion and ask about the attitude to this question, then we will get probably 34% who will blame abortion as a sin and murder, 36% do not agree with them, The other 30 do not have any definite answer or special concern about the problem. So you may see what is the real, so to say, ethical situation and moral situation. And more than 5,000 children are dying each day because of abortion. This loss is comparable with the losses during the Second World War, which you know was a devastating event in the history of our country. So as a consequence, in the perspective for 25 years, we may witness a reduction of Russian Federation population up to 100 million people, or even less. So we could lose about 40 million people just because of abortion. So I use this example to show the state of morality in Russian modern society and to show how much should be done in order to improve the situation in Russia. And we know that the Russian Orthodox Church, I will use ROC as an abbreviation, is one of the main forces and institutes in Russian society which can find real resources for this improvement. Let us see what and how it was by Russian Orthodox Church during the recent time. I will mention several important events, landmarks of starting the new epoch of Russian Orthodox Church. These are, in 1988, celebration of the festival of 1,000 years of baptizing Rus. It's a very important event. Just imagine Soviet country, no church life on the surface, and it happens the celebration of the festival of 1,000 years of baptizing Rus, an important event. Then 2000, the year of 2000, three main events. The Archpriest Council, canonization of the Tsarist families of Nicholas II. You probably know that the Tsar and his whole family was shot in Yekaterinburg. Another important event, that was the formulation of the attitude of the Russian Orthodoxy to the Christian confessions. And the third, the publishing and proclamation of the basis of the social concept of Russian Orthodox Church. For the first time in her existence, the ROC formulated fundamental principles in the relation between church and society. It marks a turnabout in the traditionally internal orientation of the ROC and an end of the age-long blind obedience of the church to the state, to the Russian state, not only in the Orthodox Church in Russia, but in the Eastern Orthodoxy in general. No other autocephalous Orthodox Church had ever expressed her social view in an official document. I will just come briefly through general characteristics of this very important document, the document of social concept of the Russian Orthodox Church. Those of you who could read Russian, probably some of you can read, do you? So, «Основы социальной концепции Русской Православной Церкви», that is the name of the document. And it was written by a committee led by the newly elected Patriarch of Russian Orthodox Church, Cyril, who was at that time, in 2000, he was the head of the Department of External Church Relations of the Moscow Patriarchate. Moscow Patriarchate is the highest authority of Russian Orthodox Church, and it is located at the Danilov Monastery in Moscow. So the document is a long-term program for the Church in a pluralistic and secularized society. The document doesn't contain a systematic treatment of the Soviet past, and the word communism is not mentioned there. This may be disappointing for those who consider it is necessary that the Russian church leaders should give a critical assessment of the recent past. However, in numerous places in the Soviet system is indicated by terms like state atheism, age of religious persecution, totalitarian ideologies, massive repressions, and the year of the Socialist Revolution, 1917. This is certainly mentioned in the document. More important is the basic notion which pervades the whole document and which is a novelty in the public political position of the Russian Church. That the state is not the aim in itself, that its power is subject to the of God and that Christians are sometimes bound by civil disobedience. That's a very new hint of the Russian attitude to the state. So the Councils of Archbishops document is divided into 16 chapters, and here are the titles of these chapters. And as you may see, they touch each problem, every problem of the social life of the society, of the Russian society. The themes can be classified into categories: those concerning church and state, and the social and ethical cases. Regarding the argumentation, it needs to be said that the statements of the document are supported by many biblical quotations and references to the church fathers, and sometimes to the Russian hierarchs of the past and saints. There is a huge board of Russian saints. Underlying a concept of a Christian anthropology, there are regular references to man's sinfulness, the origin of all social problems. Orthodox theological emphasis are also laid to stress the task of the Church in the deification of the world and the synergy of man and Christ. So, the chapter on church and nation gives an orthodox treatment of the dialectical opposition between universalism and national identity, a very important notion for Russia and for Russians. It is said that the church is a new humanity, the spiritual posteriority of the forefather Abraham, that she, the church, by her very nature is universal and therefore supernatural. The unity of the church is not based on the ethnic or cultural or linguistic community, but on faith and baptism. And therefore the spiritual homeland of all Christians is not earthly Jerusalem, but Jerusalem which is above. However, it is added to this principal Christian statement, the universal character of the church does not mean that Christians should have no right to national identity. This is the reason why the Rock is organized in national churches, поместные соборы, поместные церкви. This Orthodox view of national identity is treated as the right Christian way of thinking, and the document introduces a scale of terminological expressions: national Christian culture, dying for faith and fatherland, Christian patriotism, love of his brothers by blood who live everywhere in the world, monoconfessional Orthodox community, and Orthodox nation. This Christian attitude is advocated by referring to the patriotism of Russian saints and the support of the Russian Church in defense wars against the Mongol, Polish, French, and German invades. You know probably that all these wars happened during the history of Russia on the territory of Russia. The Mongol invasion, Polish, French, and German during the Second World War. At the same time, the document warns against aggressive nationalism, xenophobia, national exclusiveness, and inter-ethnical rivalry, and emphatically against dividing nations into the best and the worst, and teachings which reduce faith to one of the aspects of national self-awareness. This is the balancing act between Christian universalism and Orthodox nationalism. Apart from the fact that the phrase Christian patriotism is typical for our church, it is remarkable that the modern, in the Western world, more broader phrase, Christian humanism, is never used in the document. So we have another expression, Christian patriotism. In the third chapter of this very important document goes into a full consideration of the relation between church and state. It says that Genian theocracy existed in ancient Israel until the period of the kings. Although the state, which came into existence later, was sanctioned by God, it was not a reality originally established by God. The state is a consequence of the fall of man and necessary to keep evil in check. Anarchy is unchristian and the Church teaches her children to obey the state and to pray for it. At the same time, however, Christians should avoid attempts to make it absolute, and the state must not become an aim in itself. Since the kingdom of Christ is not of this world, and the state is, the latter cannot be a part of the former. The relation between the modern secular state and the Church is based on non-interference in each other's business, but that doesn't mean that the Church is not allowed to pass judgment on political decisions or that there cannot be cooperation between Church and state. Next, the document discusses 5 models of relations between Orthodox Church and the state. I will skip this for my Russian, so it's also important, but I will skip this for your audience because I think it's too deep at this moment. And we shall come to some other statements of the document. Let me see. Where it says that the Church has no power to fall silent and to stop preaching the truth, whatever other teachings may be prescribed or propagated by state bodies. In this respect, the Church is absolutely free from the state. If this leads to persecution of the Church by the state, which happened during the 70 years in my country, the Church must endure the persecution with patience, without refusing to be loyal to the state persecuting her. However, the document goes on one step further, and that is the new, by declaring that God's commandment to fulfill the task of salvation in any situation and under any circumstances is above this loyalty. If the authority forces Orthodox believers to apostatize from Christ and his Church and to commit sinful and spiritual harmful actions, the Church should refuse to obey the state. This is a call to action. Church authorities must enter in direct dialogue with the state and use democratic means to change the state's decision and appeal to her faithful for peaceful civil disobedience. This is a real new step of the Russian Orthodox Church to call for civil disobedience as the ultimate means to influence an anti-religious policy of the state. Okay. So the document deplores the loss of religiousness in the modern government system, but accepts the people's choice, or doesn't resist it at least. It rejects a superficial religious form of state, but one cannot altogether exclude the possibility of such a spiritual revival of society as to make natural a religiously higher form of government. This may be taken as a preferential reference to the Byzantine form of monarchy, which is called God-given and which was in Russia before the revolution. This is in contrast to contemporary democracies, including those monarch in form, which doesn't seek the divine sanction of power. However, the Russian Church itself doesn't wish to be an initiator in the change of form of government in accordance with its position, formulated in the early as 1994, in which it doesn't express reference to any social system or any of the existing political doctrines. It is clear that the Russian Council of Orthodox Bishops, who proclaimed and published this document, on the issue of church-state relations, try to steer a middle course between the old Byzantine and Russian Slavophile ideal of unity of church and state on the one hand, and the secularized modern reality on the other. The document occasionally conveys the idea that there was a more ideal situation for the realization of the ideals of Christianity, state, and society in the historic past. At the same time, the Church arrives at an assessment of the possibilities of the Church in the present world. Thus, already in the first chapter on theological principles, The document says right away that in order to fulfill her task, the Church must work together with the state, even if it is not Christian, and with social organizations and persons, even if they do not identify themselves with the Christian faith. The attitude of the Church towards the law is of course determined by religious premises. As appears in a passage on Christian ethics and secular law, human law must give expression to the law of God. However, secular law only contains a minimum of ethical norms and has as its task not to turn the world lying in evil into the kingdom of God, but to prevent it from turning into hell. The state's modern criminal law doesn't make punishable elements from the Ten Commandments, such as adultery and not honoring one's parents. The divergence of the divine and the human law is a consequence of the fall man, and civil criminal or constitutional law can only be based on the law of the gospel in the event of воцерковление, churchification, we could say it in English, of the whole life. In effect, this means the total triumph over sin, and that is an eschatological perspective. Nevertheless, the document says the Holy Emperor Justinian had successfully Christianized the pagan Roman law in the Corpus Juris. So the document outlines the relation between the Christian view of man and modern law. In the modern sense of justice, the Christian doctrine of man as image of God and as a being with a free will has led to the inviolability of the human person. But owing to secularization, the rights of the person have changed into rights of the autonomous individual without any relation to God, with everything being allowed as long as no damage is caused to other individuals. Not only has the relation with being image of God disappeared, but the idea of freedom has been separated from the idea of service to the other. Furthermore, the idea of utilitarian justice has come into existence. The majority determines what is legally allowed, for example, abortion. No absolute norms are recognized. The fifth chapter deals with the attitude of the Church towards political parties and organizations. Although the Church accepts the political differences and struggle, she herself aims at peace and cooperation and doesn't choose between political doctrines or organizations. She did choose, however, only when it was necessary to defend its own interests against the policy of heterodox or another religious powers. Sometimes the Church was enforced to choose by the state, which usually resulted in divisions within the Church. To avoid this, clergymen must not be a candidate in elections anymore or participate in political propaganda. So the Church wishes dialogue and cooperation with political parties, but solely for the purpose of improving the position of the Church and not in order to support a political party. But certainly for the laity, the Church encourages to be engaged in actively political position, and Orthodox politicians must allow themselves to be led by evangelical morals. High ethical sensitiveness is required from them, since many political decisions are stained with sin or connivance with sin. As for the other subjects of the Russian Orthodox social doctrine, there are of a more ethical, personal, or social nature. We shall quote a few statements. The first concerns private property. Rock recognizes this idea as divinely sanctioned in both the Old and the New Testament. The state must not take property away from the right owners. Russian history has shown that the violation of these principles has always resulted in social upheavals and people suffering. Why it is so important, this chapter on private property? Because during the 70 years of persecution, all church property was taken away by the state and mostly ruined it. Now they are giving it back to the church, but in a condition when you have to just restore it from the basement. So it is very important to stress this private property statement. On war and peace, the document states that while a Christian must patiently endure individually experienced injustice, at the same time he or she has the duty to defend himself or herself against injustice. The idea of non-violent resistance against evil, which is possible in a personal context, is resolutely rejected with regard to the collective or the people as a whole. The document mentions the notion of a justified war as it exists in the Western Christian tradition, but considered it a difficult notion in the modern world and holds that every war must be judged separately on its defensive character. More practically, it advocates cooperation between Russian Orthodox Church and the armed forces for bringing the military back to the established Orthodox traditions of service to the fatherland. The chapter Personal, Family, and Public Morality affirms the pastoral practice of mixed marriages between Orthodox and Catholics or Protestants or other traditions, religious traditions, on condition that they are blessed in Orthodox Church and that the children are brought up in Orthodox Church. That is the regulation. Orthodox Church recognizes a few grounds for divorce. The document mentions the traditional grounds such as adultery, apostasy of the partner, and natural vices, protracted absence, attempt on the life of the wife or children, and adds 3 new grounds: a partner's sufferings from AIDS, chronic alcoholism or chronic drug addiction, and a woman having an abortion against the will of the husband. The guiltless partner is allowed a second marriage, and the other party in exceptional cases after church-imposed penance. There is concern about poor contemporary family morals and the neglect of the parenthood in favor of a professional career. This applies especially to motherhood. Although the Church values the social emancipation of women and their role in public life highly, all the men and women are equal, and the husband keeps an extra responsibility for his wife, and in society the natural differences between men and women must not be ignored with regard to the division of labor. Furthermore, the document criticizes the increase of pornography in the media and speaks out against sex education in schools, which represent sex before marriage and sexual perversions as normal. In the chapter on public health, the Church not only advocates good and easily available medical facilities and psychiatry therapies which respect the human personality, but also criticizes the excessive commercialization and manipulation of sports through drugs. Furthermore, the Church is greatly alarmed by the demographic crisis in Russia, the increase of venereal diseases, epidemics, mental illnesses, and child mortality. As a major historical cause of depopulation in Russia, the document also mentions the revolutions, 3 revolutions which had happened, famines, and massive repressions of recent past. The document devotes harsh words to the problem of alcoholism and drug addiction. In the lengthy chapter on bioethics, abortion is categorically rejected as murder. At the same time, the Church advocates a lenient pastoral approach in case the abortion is performed because of the woman's life in danger, especially if she has other children. In that case, she must not be excluded from Eucharist, and also she is obliged to do penance. With regard to the contraceptives, there are also some special regulations, and the document addresses the ideology of the so-called reproductive rights and the medical possibilities in the area. As for childlessness, the Church allows artificial insemination with sperm cells of the husband, but condemns the use of the donor material from a third party, surrogate motherhood, and various forms of its vitro fertilization. And the Church rejects the reproductive rights of single women and men, as well as persons with so-called non-standard sexual orientation. Both cases of the child's right to a father and a mother, and because of the violation of the divine order. Also, the document is not opposed to gene therapy, and there are several statements to show that the Church is not opposing to prenatal diagnostics and other new medical care, but also categorically rejects euthanasia, which is a form of homicide or suicide, and the attempts to legalize it. And the document goes into a lengthy discussion of the theme of homosexuality, which is unequivocally deplored by Holy Scriptures and the teaching of the Church, as it is demonstrated in the document by a series of quotations. The Russian Orthodox Church condemns the representation of homosexuality as a natural phenomenon. It is a sinful distortion of human nature. The Church is just as clear on transsexual or sex change, which is called a rebellion against the Creator. Some other subjects. The last 4 pages deal with more general social subjects: environmental, science, culture, education, mass media, globalization, secularization. And in treating the subject of ecology, the document points at the connection between the fall of man and the disruption of his relation with nature. The environmental crisis is directly linked with modern man's spiritual crisis. In dealing with science, the document warns of the danger of ideologized science, for which the nations have paid too high a price in the 20th century. It says of culture that it can transmit Christian values, especially when the influence of Christianity itself in society has decreased or disappeared. In Russia, that was the case in the years of state atheism, when classical Russian literature and art were often the only source of religious knowledge for many people. And you know Dostoevsky, and you know Tolstoy, and some Russian Orthodox philosophers who lived abroad. They were the only source of thinking, the source of reflecting upon the Christian roots of Russian people. In connection with the theme of education, the Church calls for the removal of the remnants of atheism, control, and for the possibility of optional religious education in state schools. So, the last chapter, structurally rather isolated at the end of the document, is about international relations and globalization, and in this connection also mentions secularization with regard to the process of globalization in the fields of law and politics. The Orthodox Church has a critical and careful approach. The last statements express the dilemma of the Orthodox Church in the modern world. I'm quoting, "The contemporary international legal system is based on the priority given to the interests of earthly life of man and human communities over religious values, while respecting the worldview of non-religious people and their right to influence social processes. The Church cannot favor a world order that puts in the center of everything the human personality that is darkened by sin. The global process in politics implies an ongoing secularization in the face of which the Church must go on defending the Christian values. She does so by striving for the recognition of the legality of religious worldview as a basis for socially significant action." At this point, I close my lecture and would be glad to hear your questions, to answer if possible. So, probably it was very condensed, but I wanted to show you that the problems of Russian Orthodoxy are this, and that. And some of you feel that they are in common for the whole world, and probably for many churches and for many religious denominations. So I would be glad to have some conversation now with you. after a small gulp of water. I'm thirsty all the time. So, Jim, please, open the floor.
So, thank you very much. This is very fascinating.
Thank you.
So I find this very interesting in terms of the balancing that sort of has to go on between particularly the church and state issues. This part about the private property, I found quite fascinating. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit. It seems that there are particular political parties which have a different stance on private property. This question basically of socialism versus capitalism or something. Is there, as far as this is elaborated either in the document or by theologians and other thinkers, is this a topic that's relevant? I mean, it seems like this is part of the convergence towards a more economic capitalism is sort of, at least in some sense, becoming more dominant. Pockets of communism are less and less favorable. Are there strong currents against communism per se, even if it's not associated with the atheism?
So you know, it happens that that is one of the main issues now of the church and state relationship, because the church sees it as the main principle of its independence from the church and also of the revival of the church. Because really so many property was taken away, and property which is not only the church buildings but also a lot of goods which you probably know, gold and silver, icons, and it is not only the objects, but these are the spiritual heritage of the church. And when it is taken away and took by the state as just the commercial things, probably even to sell as icons, as some other objects of art, then the church is against it, and that's the trouble. It's a troubling matter for her. And also the matter of bringing back the property of the church is also symbolizes the property of a man, of the social right of a man to have a property. The property which is individual property, which was not recognized during the socialist time, as you know. Everything was for the state. The person had no right to have personal property at all. So the church revives the notion of property of a person, which is also very important. Not to speak about the property of many Russian people who had to go abroad, to go in exile, and left their property in the country, and now wanted to come back and probably to negotiate with the church about bringing it back. So many aspects of economical thinking, but not only. Also thinking in theological terms are important. I don't know whether I just...
follow up with, so there's this issue in the New Testament where Paul talks about consecrating property, essentially to have communal property. A lot of these Western or other Christian theologians have interpreted this in terms of an abrogation of private property. Perhaps voluntary, that's different, but...
voluntary, that is true. Sometimes it is voluntary, can be given to someone, but the whole notion has to be revived. This privacy, private property. And so I think it's very important. Any other?
I guess towards the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century,
I'm trying to find the position when this will not be, fortunately, I cannot escape it. Okay, I shall be here.
Maybe 1 or 2 feet that way. Just 1 meter that way, I think you'll be okay.
A little bit here. Okay, here I am. Good. Now it's very, very convenient.
we build up the suspense. My question. We kind of see at that point, before all the revolutions come about, seemingly one after another, almost every couple of years, we don't see a major fall in faith, but we see a major fall in faith in the authority of the Orthodox Church. That's what led to a lot of upheavals and people kind of relying on the individual and less on the church. What is the Orthodox Church doing, I guess, today to kind of keep that from happening a second time? What are they doing to build up their church members so that they don't feel like the authority of the church is falling again?
You know, nobody can predict anything in this sense, you know. But I think you raise a question which is not only in the church, but a little bit more broader. Why the authority will not do the same? It can happen not only with the church authority, but also with the state authority. And unfortunately, we cannot predict this. And what we can see in the secular life, I mean the governmental things which are happening now in Russia, could show you some step back from the democratic principles proclaimed during Perestroika. Now there is a step back in governmental principles and in governmental, in the behavior of our governors, of our authorities, state authorities. As for the church, there is only hope and praying that they will support members of the church with all these proclamations of the document. But there is no guarantee. Only support of, I think, you know, the authorities can be isolated, like it happens with the state authorities in our country. But the church authorities are really leaning upon the members of the church. And so the support of the church, of the church members as prayers, as actions, can, I think, prevent the fall and the sinful and the harmful actions of the authorities of the church. That is the hope.
Do you think this document helped with that?
I think these proclamations at least give some clear guidance to the church members. You know, there was a serious gap between the priests speaking to the people, speaking to the church members, and the people themselves. There was isolation because usually the services at the church are on Church Slavonic, not in Russian language. And this language, after all these days of losses of the church culture, evaporated. Nobody knows, except several scholars and scientists, church language. So, and there were no sermons for a long, long time at the church, even after the services. Only the service, the liturgy itself. And so no communication. And that was a big distance between the people and the priests in language. And so the church members were not led neither by the human expression, human communication with the priest, nor with any literal documents. Now we have the possibility to preach in the church, and also the document shows something. You could read it. You could then fight, oh, you wrote it. Please show us what are the fruits of this document. So this is the importance of the document gives the right to the members of the church to proclaim their own rights, to ask the administration of the church, the bishops, the high authorities of the church, how do they follow this conception. So in this sense, everything which is stated by word is already a serious action. Logos, you know, the power of the word.
Yeah, I was surprised to learn that the church had canonized the family of Nicholas II. I don't know much about the family, but with reference to Nicholas II, I've always learned that Bloody Sunday was an atrocity independent of what followed thereafter, the Bolshevik Revolution, but did that action of canonization spark any protest because of Nicholas II's neglect or even abuse of the Russian people?
There was a lot of battles during this period of negotiation between the church authorities and the bishops. Huge battle. But I think that the mere fact that it happened was a very, very strong impact on the church and on the members of the church, and also on the members, not on the members of the church, just for the Russian authorities and for the Russian people in general, because it showed the power of, you probably know that Nicholas II, that his wife and the whole family was very religious family. Though probably he was a very weak emperor, a weak Tsar in his actions and in his commands for the war which happened during his time. But as a religious people, they always supported the church. And proclamation and sanctification of the family was not only a gesture of I have forgotten the word, but not only the gesture of to recognize their religiosity and their attempts to help the church during that time, but also the significance of revelation, significance of salvation through the church. And so in this fact, in this canonization, I think the people, just the ordinary people, got a support to become closer to God, to know more about the history of also of our emperors, because during the time of the Soviet, we were not even permitted to know much about the Russian history. We learned just some important facts, and mostly about the Communist Party, and mostly about the revolution, and the Second World War, which is certainly important, but not about the history of the country, which is so closely connected with the history of the church itself. The whole history of the country is the history of the church. So we were not permitted to know this. And so in this sanctification, we were permitted already to come to the history, to learn more. So it was a very important event, really. But the battles were.
Thank you very much. That was very, very much.
Thank you.